The night was cold, but the betrayal cut deeper than any winter chill. She stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The man she had trusted, the one who had vowed to love and protect her, had shattered her world with a single, unforgivable act. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she turned away, stepping into the darkness with nothing but the clothes on her back and the painful weight of his deception pressing down on her chest. For years, she remained a ghost, disappearing from his life as if she had never existed. No calls. No letters. No trace of where she had gone. He searched at first, but time wore down his efforts, and soon, he convinced himself that she was simply a part of his past, one he would never have to face again. But secrets have a way of resurfacing, and fate was not done with them yet. One unexpected encounter, one piece of information, and suddenly his world tilted on its axis. The truth, the real reason she had left, was something he never saw coming. And now, as he stands at the edge of a revelation that could change everything, the question remains, is it too late to make things right? Or has the past already sealed their fate? The wind howled outside as he sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the name on the screen. His heart pounded in his chest. It had been years since she had vanished, years since he had convinced himself that she had moved on, that she had chosen to leave him behind. And yet, here she was. A trace of her, a whisper of the past refusing to be buried. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face. Why now? Why, after all this time, was she resurfacing? He had tried to reach her once, countless times in fact, after she had disappeared. He had searched, asked questions, chased rumors, but every lead had turned into a dead end. Eventually, he had accepted the silence, believing she had made her choice. And so, he moved on, or at least, that's what he told himself. But the truth had a cruel way of unraveling at the worst possible moment. She had spent the past years in hiding, living in the shadows, always looking over her shoulder. When she had left that night, she had no plan. No destination, just the desperate need to escape. Betrayal had shattered her world, but it wasn't just heartbreak that had driven her away. It was fear. Fear of what he might do if he found out the truth. Fear of what staying might have cost her. She had built a new life from the ground up, one where she could breathe without the weight of lies pressing against her chest. But even after all this time, the past still haunted her. Every time she walked down a crowded street, every time she heard a familiar voice, her heart clenched with the fear that he had finally found her. And now, it seemed, that moment had arrived. Somewhere, somehow, he had stumbled upon the truth, or at least a piece of it. He didn't know everything. Not yet. But he knew enough to dig deeper, and that terrified her more than anything. She had worked so hard to bury the past, to keep the secrets locked away. Because if he discovered everything, if he learned the real reason she had left, it would change everything. The memory of that night still burned in his mind. The way she had looked at him, her eyes filled with something beyond pain, something he hadn't understood back then. He had assumed it was betrayal, anger, heartbreak. But now, as the pieces started to shift, he realized he had missed something crucial. What if she hadn't left because she wanted to? What if she had left because she had to? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. What had he done? Or worse, what had he not seen? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. He had to find her. He had to hear the truth from her own lips. But as he prepared to take the first step down that path, a gnawing fear took hold. What if the truth was more devastating than he could handle? And what if, after all these years, she no longer wanted to be found? He stared at the screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. The name, the tiny breadcrumb of a lead, was enough to set everything in motion. He had spent years convincing himself that she was gone, that she had walked away without a second thought. But now, doubt twisted in his chest like a knife. If she had truly wanted to disappear forever, why did she leave traces behind? The search had been exhausting, but persistence had finally paid off. A small town quiet, unassuming had become her refuge. He couldn't imagine her there, living a life so different from the one they had shared. But she had built something new, something that didn't include him. What had driven her away? He had believed with every fiber of his being that she had betrayed him. That night, when everything fell apart, he had seen only his own pain. He had assumed she had made a choice to leave. But what if he had been wrong? What if there had been something else? Something he had never understood? He needed answers. The journey to find her was restless, his thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. By the time he reached the small town, a storm was brewing, thick clouds rolling across the sky. The kind of storm that felt like an omen. He wasn't sure if it was a warning or a promise. When he finally saw her, his breath caught in his throat. She was different, yet painfully familiar. Time had changed her, but not enough to erase the woman he had once loved. For a moment, all the questions, all the anger, all the confusion faded away. But then she saw him. Her body stiffened, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked too much like fear. She took a step back, gripping the strap of her bag as if preparing to run. He raised his hands, palms up, a silent plea. "I just want to talk." Her hesitation lasted too long, an agonizing moment where he thought she might disappear again. But then slowly, she nodded. The cafe was nearly empty, the rain tapping lightly against the windows. The air between them was heavy, charged with too many unspoken words. He barely recognized the voice that came out of his mouth. "Why did you leave?" She let out a shaky breath, looking down at her hands. "Because I had no choice." His jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with something raw. "You think I left because I wanted to? You think I ran because I was guilty?" Her voice cracked, and for the first time he saw the depth of her pain. "You don't know what happened that night. You don't know what I was protecting." The weight of her words sent a chill through him. Protecting? He had spent so long believing in his own version of the story that he had never stopped to consider hers. "I need to know the truth," he said, his voice softer now. Her hands trembled as she took a deep breath. "That night, I found out something that changed everything." She swallowed hard. "Someone betrayed you, but it wasn't me." His mind raced, searching for meaning in her words. "What are you saying?" "I was trying to protect you," she whispered. "From the moment I found out the truth, I knew they would come after me. And if I stayed, you would have been in danger too." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been blind, so consumed by his own pain that he hadn't seen what had really been happening. She had left to save him. Guilt crashed over him in waves. "Who?" he asked, his voice tight. "Who did this to us?" She hesitated, then gave him the name. His blood ran cold. It was someone he had trusted. Someone who had been close to him. Someone he never would have suspected. Everything he had believed for years had been a lie. Regret surged through him, choking the breath from his lungs. "I should have known," he whispered. Her eyes glistened. "I wanted to tell you, but if I did, they would have hurt you. I couldn't take that risk." A heavy silence hung between them, filled with all the years they had lost. Finally, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. "I should have fought for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have believed in us." She blinked back tears. "I thought about coming back so many times, but I was afraid. Afraid of what you'd think. Afraid it was too late." "It's not," he said firmly. "It's not too late." Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile but real. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the scent of rain and the promise of something new.